the newsagents.
The Prime Minister had a difficulty in reaching clear, consistent positions. Ample evidence relating to oscillation or backing and veering, whatever have you. Did you observe that? Because, of course, you were there.
I think that the way that Mr. Johnson took decisions was unique to him.
Well, no, if I may interrupt, that's a euphemism if ever I've heard it. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, he has a quite distinct style, but I think lots of other people have got quite distinct styles.
That, as you can probably hear, is not Dominic Cummings. It's Chris Whitty, the Chief Medical Officer, who was taking us through his testimony to the COVID inquiry. And he is at such pains there to try not to implicate the people he was working with too closely. And as he does so, he basically throws them under a bus.
Exactly. Whilst other witnesses before this committee have gone in armed with chainsaws, machetes and machine guns, he brought with him a feather duster today. But that doesn't make his testimony any less important, because people are hanging on his every word, because this is so vital for the government's reputation at the end of it. Welcome to the newsagents. It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And the COVID inquiry has not really progressed in the way of a traditional public inquiry, where it all tends to be very learned and very thoughtful and very considered, and you have to read the runes before you can come to any kind of conclusion about what someone is saying. And what we've had in this one, from Dominic Cummings and others, is just, oh my God, the chaos and shambles at the heart of government absolutely laid bare. And the kind of joyful addition of all these WhatsApp messages where you can see the total disrespect in which they all hold each other, which is so unique, where normally you have this sort of front presented that we were all getting on jolly well and we were trying to do our best in very difficult circumstances. All of that, I think, probably is true, that they were trying to do their best in difficult circumstances. But the kind of extent to which, Boris Johnson didn't understand the science, that has all been laid bare. And today, of course, Sir Chris Whitty, the Chief Medical Officer for England, giving his version of events, the man we saw every night on our television screens at those 5 p.m. Downing Street news conferences.
And I think what's clear from Chris Whitty today and Patrick Vallance yesterday, these two figures who really were sort of part of all our homes and our lives for so long. They were on the TV every single evening at those press briefings, was the tightrope that they were walking between what they were advising and how strongly they felt able to tell ministers what to do. And actually, you heard from Chris Whitty today that he said, I was very blunt about the decisions we were taking, but I didn't turn to ministers and say, you must. They tried to carve out, in other words, a scientific, a medical role that did not tell ministers what to do. And he kind of let the cat out the bag when he said that the worst bit for them was this mantra the government adopted, which was that they were following the science. And he said it soon became a millstone around our necks because it blurred the demarcation between the technical advice that we were giving and the political decisions that Boris Johnson and the others were then taking. If the cabinet could carry on saying we were following the science, then suddenly everyone was pointing at Vallance and Whitty and they were saying, hang on a second, we just put the technicalities of the virus and what we knew before you.
There was such emphasis at the time being put naturally upon, the political players, Johnson, Hancock, Sunak and the rest of them. We tended, I think, journalistically to give everything that the scientists were saying, including Whitty and Vallance, just instant more sort of credibility, credence, respect. I remember speaking to people in government at the time who and I was thought, well, they probably would say this, but on reflection, maybe they had a point, which was to say, it's often assumed that there is this sort of set of scientific advice that we just receive and that we choose to ignore it or we choose to adhere to it. You've got to understand there is a lot of disagreement, a lot of competing advice, a lot of different agenda which are at play here. And one of the interesting things that has sort of come out in the last couple of days, obviously, because you've had Vallance, the scientific advisor, and you've had Whitty, the chief medical officer, two figures who were at the centre of it that people assume were in lockstep. And there has been all this suggestion over this past 24 hours of disagreement between the two of them, even on something as fundamental as the timing of the first lockdown, with Vallance at the inquiry yesterday saying that, I was minded to have gone earlier than, for example, Chris Whitty, who was thinking more about the wider public health implications. And so all of these kind of things that we were just not privy to at the time, now emerging slowly through this inquiry. And some people actually in Westminster are unhappy about one thing, which is some people in the government, and I can understand why they might think this, are increasingly thinking this is an inquiry which is focusing too much on the personalities, focusing too much on the individuals, rather than what they think it should be about, which is about the systemic lessons for a potential another inquiry, rather than individual culpability. I mean, in a sense, maybe it's a bit like the comparison to be drawn here is it's kind of becoming like you could argue, like a medical scientific Leveson inquiry, which is obviously about media and about politics. It's almost impossible to resist the allure of investigating those individual relationships and individual sets of responsibilities.
I do think that critique or criticism would have more weight if you didn't have such big personalities at the heart of government during that time. And I think it is almost impossible, to take Boris Johnson's personality out of how the COVID process was handled. We know that he offered to shake hands with people to show that COVID was fine, in their hospital beds going round. We know, we've had revealed that he thought it would be a good idea to get given the virus, have himself injected with the virus to prove that it was all smoke and mirrors.
I still can't believe that.
I mean, just to repeat those things out loud, you are not dealing with a system. You're dealing with a man who was actually playing at being an emperor during that time of COVID, who thought somehow he could magically wash away the virus because he knew how to deal with it, whereas the scientists all got their knickers in a twist over something that they didn't really understand.
All the time this was going on, I was on the other side of the Atlantic and reporting from Washington.
You had a real emperor.
Where there was another emperor who was equally as capricious and irascible and determined to go his own way and not follow advice. And yet, America locked down over a week before the UK. Even Donald Trump was persuaded of the need by the Centers for Disease Control and, Fauci and all the rest of them, that this had to happen. And so it was on the 15th of March that he kind of stood up and said, we've got 15 days to slow the spread of the virus. And he was only going to close down the US for 15 days, but actually it stayed on for an extra month until the end of April, because they kind of realised that if they wanted to slow the transmission rate of the disease, you had to act more quickly. And it seemed incredible to me in Washington that this was not happening in Britain, and that Britain was still open for business and still going on. And it was as if it was kind of wishful thinking that it wouldn't need to come to this. And that was down to Boris as well.
This was basically the admission we got from Chris Whitty today, that they should have, on balance, locked down earlier.
So I was very aware that we essentially had two different things we were trying to balance. The risk of going too early, in which case you get all the damages from this with actually fairly minimal impact on the epidemic, and the risk of going too late, in which case you get all the problems of the pandemic running away. Now, as we will, I'm sure, come on to, my view is, with the benefit of hindsight, we went a bit too late on the first wave, and I've been very clear about that for some time.
And after that point in the exchanges, the KC for the inquiry pushed him, because that has been a line which has been repeated, during the pandemic itself ever since, which is the idea of hindsight. And of course, hindsight's 2020, we know that, it's a cliche. We know that there are lots of things that we would have done differently now, because there are things we know now that we didn't know then. The point, John, that you just identified is central, and I think one that the inquiry will return to in the fullness of time, which is that there were people at the time advocating for swifter action by mid-March. I remember you and Emily, you and I were on Newsnight at the time. I remember we mocked up this graph that basically showed all of the different interventions, including lockdown interventions, that different countries around the world were currently making at that time, including the United States, including travel restrictions and so on. And the UK had none of them. Now, we got enormous pushback from Number 10 the next day. I remember that. There was, basically really criticising us really hard, basically saying this is an irresponsible graph, we shouldn't have shown it. It doesn't take account of everything that we're doing. Well, I think in retrospect, and as we could see at the time, it did demonstrate something. It showed that the UK we weren't behind the epidemiological curve, we were behind the political curve of where we probably needed to be at that time. And whilst I have enormous, and I think this was overlooked sometimes, I think it was right that government was careful about what it did, because it was too easy at that time to overlook the other public health and policy implications of lockdown, which were profound and immense, it is clear that Johnson's particular proclivity at that time against actions like that, because of his own instincts, political instincts around these things, it did cost us. And that is going to be a conclusion, I'm sure, the inquiry draws.
Yeah, I mean, Chris Whitty, again today, said he was slightly slower on it because he had included in his assessment all those other factors to which he just alluded, whether it was shutting the schools, whether it was mental health, whether it was a knock-on to people's livelihoods as well as lives. And I guess, these are all the things coming at you at the same time. And a matter of, he says, the risk of going too early would have been, he said, that the biggest impact of all those things would have been in areas of deprivation, which was actually exactly what happened.
Yep.
I mean, we know that people in poorer areas, or we know that people who had to stay off school and didn't have access to computers, or those of kids in care, all the rest of it, were much, much more badly affected. So I guess, yes, this is the thing that you're always weighing up. But I just think it's interesting that, the vision I keep on getting is the one of Italy, literally, which was always said 2 weeks ahead of us. And they had cleared out their public spaces. They had cleared out every single, sort of landmark in Italy. And we were still sending people to the Cheltenham races. Not sending people, but, the contrast was very stark. And I do think that comes back to that whole point again, which is it that you're being careful about kids in care? Is it that you're being careful about people with mental health? Or is it just that you think you've got your iron plating on, you don't think it can happen to us?
Exactly.
It's something that happens to foreigners, not Brits.
Exactly. And I think that is why the character and personality of Boris Johnson is intrinsic to this inquiry, because of the natural boosterism. Oh, it's all going to be fine. We've got nothing much to worry about. Don't you worry. Keep calm. Carry on.
Optimism can solve everything.
Optimism can solve everything. When I was in Washington and seeing that Britain still hadn't done anything, I thought, this is mad. Are you not seeing what everyone else is doing around the rest of the world? When even Donald Trump, who absolutely hated the whole idea of shuttering the economy, particularly because it had such a profound effect on the Dow Jones share price, which was how he measured his success. It's over 30,000. And then when he saw the Dow drop, he thought, oh my God, look, this is the decision I've taken. But they still took that in the US.
Well, who is his hero? Who is Boris? Not from a classical period, but from, in fact, not someone who doesn't even exist. But it's the mayor from Jaws. Boris Johnson always said his hero is the mayor from Jaws, who is the guy who keeps the town open even when it looks like the threat from the shark is coming. And Dominic Cummings, for what it's worth, whether we believe him or not, but he has said that, when the time was coming for when Johnson was considering the second lockdown, the third lockdown, he just kept saying, I wish I'd been the mayor from Jaws.
Sorry, I don't mean to show my ignorance on this one, but did quite a lot more people get eaten in Jaws?
Well, yeah.
But the beach was open. But the Townsville, was it Townsville? I'm trying to remember what the name.
I'm trying to think. It's not Amityville, because it's Amityville horror, but it's.
I think what we need to do in post.
We haven't gone down a rabbit hole, have we? Here, by any chance?
My point is, Jaws would not have been a thriller if the mayor had opened the beach and nothing had happened. The mayor opened the beach and people kept on getting eaten by sharks.
It's possible, of course, that this wasn't the perfect metaphor to guide one as a policymaker during the COVID pandemic. But the thing is as well, this isn't just completely historical, but in the sense that, yes, a lot of these players have left the stage. Johnson's gone, Hancock's gone, and plenty of others. Of course, the person who hasn't is the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, who is Chancellor and a central figure in all of this. And he's usually actually credited a lot with his, and the Treasury in particular, as being one of the bits of government that did act quickly, that manoeuvred well,
he was the darling of the pandemic because he
was paying everyone's wages, right?
Exactly,
in a way that was completely unprecedented, and it went outside, unlike, you could argue, Johnson, went outside his kind of particular kind of ideological framework in so doing. But then there were other bits, and this is something that was referred to yesterday, which I actually think, when you strip away some of the more headline grabbing bits where Vallance saying that Johnson was bamboozled by science and all these sorts of things, this was the most shocking bit to me, just in terms of the processes of government point, which is that on Sunak's now sort of infamous scheme, Eat Out to Help Out, where the government in the summer of 2020 subsidised, Treasury literally subsidised hospitality industries by going out and having meals, and the government would subsidise it at great expense. But the argument was that the hospitality industry desperately needed a kind of adrenaline boost to keep it going, having been closed for so long. That Vallance was not consulted, he said, about the potential public health impact of that scheme being rolled out. And had he been so, he would have advised that it would have had a detrimental impact in terms of the resurgence of the virus. Admittedly, in that summer, the virus was low, low incidence in most places, but nonetheless, that it would put us in a bad place for when the inevitable return came in the autumn and winter. Now, Sunak had said in his written inquiry, and Sunak will address the inquiry directly, but he's made a written submission, and he said that he does not recall the chief medical officer or the chief scientific advisor at any point saying they thought it was a bad idea. So this sort of this variance in accounts has the possibility of, really being quite damaging for Sunak, particularly as we remember that he was so visible at the forefront of that. Remember, he was going up in different restaurants and he had a little Rishi badge. Yeah, exactly. And all that sort of
he
stuff.
had his badge on, didn't he?
Yeah, literally.
But the interesting thing about that is that it may well be the case that Rishi Sunak doesn't remember them giving advice saying this is a bad thing to do. It's a bit late if the decision's already been taken without them having been consulted on it. The force of Sir Chris Whitty today is that what he's done is he sounded like a traditional civil servant, that he was saying, it's not my job to criticise politicians. I can tell you what I did. And it was the old mantra of advisors advise and ministers decide, and he was saying that is the correct way round for things to happen. But if you have not had the chance to advise and ministers have decided, then you're in a really uncomfortable position. And for Rishi Sunak, I think that's really serious.
Especially as it was literally the polar opposite to what the scientists would have wanted to see happening.
Completely.
Would you have wanted more people in a public space all together at the same time? Probably not. Is that what happened? Yes. And actually, when Rishi Sunak was asked about it, and we'll play that clip, he was asked about it by our colleague Nick Ferrari when he was doing the hustings, actually, for leadership last year, he doubles down on it.
Some reports suggest, going back to COVID, that your Eat Out to Help Out programme led to, some reports suggest, a 17% spike in COVID infections. With hindsight, which is great, of course, was it a mistake?
No.
God forbid. Would you do something like that again?
I mean, if you think what happened is almost every country in Europe ended up having exactly the same spike in infections thereafter.
I mean, it's a kind of odd place to come from that, which is like, oh, it was going to rise anyway, so we might as well do it. I mean, I guess the counterfactual is we will never know. If we hadn't have done Eat Out to Help Out, would we have kept the number of infections lower? That is the presumption, I think, of the scientists, right? That we wouldn't have had to take the next measures because we wouldn't have had that rise in spikes. Rishi Sunak seems very calm about his analysis, which is like, oh, it was going to happen anyway because it happened to everyone else.
I think there is a sort of there's a subplot here which is taking place in terms of the conversation among government scientists. Is if this were to happen again, was the idea, we've already referred to it, was the idea of having Vallance and Whitty flanking the Prime Minister or whatever political figure it was, night after night, a good idea in one sense, or should they have done something separately? In the sense that by doing that, it gave the impression that everything the government did had been given the kind of imprimatur, the legitimacy of the science. And
they
that
were
is
his
indeed,
wingman.
They were, exactly. And it was quite interesting yesterday, the former chief medical officer for Wales, in an interview doing with the BBC, actually said that she had thought, now in retrospect, it was a bad idea to have that scientific legitimacy conferred on everything the government was doing, even though they would say that isn't what they were saying. They would be asked their advice that they were walking a tightrope, but that they were in effect a form of cover for everything the government was doing. And you can see why they wanted to do that, because it gave, when people, the public were watching it, it gave it authority.
Yeah, and
it
reassurance.
Gave it reassurance.
I think that level of reassurance was really important, because we would not have
why I think it's right.
any of that messaging.
But
You're right.
should it have been done with the politician? That's the question that she was raising. And I think that is an interesting thing to consider when you hear, particularly when you hear Whitty and Vallance now talk in retrospect about how they felt
I
sometimes
don't think you
they
could have
were
split
used.
it up, because
or
you
maybe
would not have trusted the politician without
Exactly.
the
Totally.
scientists, and it would not have been fair to ask the scientists
To be
political
to
questions
front this up.
exactly about the economy whilst they were talking about
And
the
it was
virus.
just the same in the White House briefing room,
Yeah.
where you'd have Deborah Birx and you'd have Anthony Fauci at the same time as you'd have Donald
what's
Trump.
interesting, of course, is that Fauci was absolutely villainised by sections of the right, of the sort of the MAGA crowd, for his role in that. And thank God that hasn't happened here. I don't see anyone actually blaming the scientists. And we did, I remember on Newsnight, we did have outrider thoughts, and we did have the sort of centrist thoughts when it came to the virus. And we tried to give a sense, and I think the country got a sense of, the people who said we've got to move all the old people to Scotland in an ideal world because that's the only way of keeping them safe. And the people who said, I'm sorry, we've just got to keep all the young locked down because that's the only way you keep the vast majority safe. We had that difference of opinion, and I think it was expressed. We didn't villainise our scientists, thank God.
The other thing to bear in mind in this particular case, in the British context, is the sort of rivalry between government departments and the Treasury thinking it is by far the cleverest and most capable government department in Whitehall, and it knows best. And you can just imagine the Treasury thinking, do we want to ask permission of Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance before we, launch this? No, I think we can. I think because we know what the advice will be if we ask them, let's go ahead, because we believe that for the sake of the economy, this is the best thing that we could possibly do.
And that's rightly so. It is rightly so. As Whitty himself said today, they're there to advise. They're not there to make policy.
Yeah.
They're particularly outside of the area of public health, which is his expertise and the area with which he has authority. So that's right. There was one other sort of subplot we learned today, and then one other thing in terms of Sunak. One is about Simon Case, the cabinet secretary, who is currently on a leave of absence from Number 10 due to an illness. It's not specified what it is, but he was due to be addressing the COVID inquiry himself. This was supposed to be a delay for a couple of weeks. The principals of the COVID inquiry have now been given a briefing today, a more detailed briefing, to suggest that it won't be for some time now. And that is sort of starting to pose some questions within Whitehall about how long this absence might be, because the cabinet secretary is the most senior civil servant in the country, heads the cabinet secretariat, very, very senior. There's not much precedent for an extended leave of absence. Jeremy Haywood, who was cabinet secretary before, became very ill and was then replaced in reasonably short order. I think there'll be more and more questions about, if this is going to go on, whether Case may have to be replaced by the government. And the other thing I was just going to say, I think there is an interesting thing to consider in terms of what political damage, if any, this might cause Sunak or the government now. I think there is a thing about Eat Out to Help Out, and you can already see Labour with some of their material sort of making hay out of it. I think there is an interesting thing about the extent to which, not the whole country by any stretch of the imagination, not least people who were affected by it in a sense they had relatives die and so on, but there is an interesting thing about how many people want to forget the pandemic. And at the time, I remember speaking to a Labour person not long after the sort of biggest part of the crisis was over, and he said to me, look, it took us a long time to realise there was no politics in this, but when we did realise it, it became much easier for us, in the sense that it was such a traumatic time. It was such a difficult time. I remember reading something at the start of the pandemic about the last pandemic in 1918-19, and I remember there was a whole chapter at the end of it, an amazing book called Pale Rider, which basically said this was a bigger event than the First World War. It actually caused more political change, arguably, in the First World War. Certainly more people died. Why don't we remember it? And one of the arguments was it was just too traumatic. There were no heroes like there is in a war. There's no glory. And I remember it being in the middle of the pandemic thinking, that seems impossible. Amazing. This is the biggest political event of our lives. And yet here we are in 2023, and I think it's extraordinary how much has slipped back and how little we want to remember. The politics of remembrance is very interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting how far away from it we feel in one respect now. But I'd go back to something you said right at the beginning, which was about hindsight. And in a sense, I have a lot of sympathy. I think we all have a lot of sympathy for people trying to make incredibly difficult decisions, life or death decisions, about something that they couldn't possibly have foreseen and that was literally sort of affecting every country in the world to some degree or another.
And they've got no reference book that kind of guides them.
But the one thing I'd say about the hindsight, and I think this tempers it, is that we cannot now hear this inquiry and all these actors in this inquiry without being conscious of Partygate that came afterwards. And I think that has undone so much of the public goodwill, the public ability to sort of suspend their sense of right and wrong because it was such an unknown time and a difficult sort of traumatic thing to be handling. And I think there is no way now actually, of taking the inquiry out from, again, the personalities, the people involved, the fixed penalty notices, everything that we know went on in Downing Street and around Downing Street at that time. I think it makes it much, much harder for the public to actually move on and just listen to the science and the rationale and the decision making, actually.
I mean, it's so interesting you say that, because I think, when we had Matt Hancock on, and he couldn't quite get, and I've heard Nadine Dorries, flogging her book, again, kind of underplaying Partygate. What don't you get about the offence it caused the British people, who overwhelmingly were obeying every bloody rule that was laid down because they thought that is what they needed to do to protect themselves and to protect their vulnerable loved ones, and to see what was going on in Downing Street during that period was just egregious and morally offensive. And actually, if God forbid there was another national emergency where you had to say to people, stay at home, who's going to obey it?
In a moment, we'll have the second half. I'm just doing what I'm told here.
It's brilliantly done that.
Thank you.
It's a real tease,
Seamless.
that.
Yeah.
I can't
Seamless.
wait to hear what you come up with.
What a segue.
And now the economy.
Oh,
That was a great
God,
pickup,
that was
right?
Great.
Thank
that
you.
was so good.
Thank you.
And
Yeah.
also, I'm excited now.
Yeah,
Where you said that.
Yeah.
Really set out the
know
stall well
Yeah.
of what little offerings we're going to give you.
Look, COVID in the economy. What could be better?
So the funny thing is, I mean, what Lewis just did now was very similar in a way to what Rishi Sunak did yesterday, which was gave a
See, here we
speech
go.
that no one was actually expecting to hear, and not
No one
many
wanted.
people actually covered. I mean, a lot of the broadcasters were still following the COVID inquiry, which they've been sort of set up to follow. And Rishi Sunak delivered this speech yesterday, which he meant to give a week ago, last Wednesday, when we saw the rather big drop in inflation. And of course, that was swiftly followed by the Rwanda decision, which declared the government's policy unlawful. And Rishi Sunak pulled his speech, I guess, because he didn't want to have to talk about the Rwanda stuff when he wanted to talk about the economy. So here we had this setting out of a stall on the Monday of the week, which contains the autumn statement, which is meant to be the Chancellor's domain.
With 5 new pledges, 5 new objectives, even
But
though
not that
only...
new.
Does that mean we've got 10 pledges?
Well, it's not entirely clear, even though, by the way, only 1 of the initial 5 is definitely being met, maybe 2, depending on what the Chancellor says yesterday, but 3 of them most certainly aren't. So now we've got sort of 5 new ones, which include, things that you might argue are a little bit on the anodyne side, like, for example, backing British business, which, I mean, there hasn't actually been a government, certainly that I can remember.
I want him to
There was
stand
like, no, we're
let's
actually going
not
to... Mind you, Johnson
British
did, of
business.
course, famously say...
yeah, business.
Yeah. So I suppose, in a
That
way,
wasn't my
that is a bit
swearing,
of a
just
change.
for the record, that was definitely his.
Yeah, but it was an excuse used by you to swear again.
No, but it is
Yes,
a very
it
good
was.
point that just when you think that the slogans are completely meaningless, you remember that Boris Johnson managed to invert even the meaningless slogans.
No,
to
I
something
always
quite-
think that, the basic sort of laws of journalism
Yeah.
are, what is the news story? Is it a news story to say, we support a world-class education? The better news story would be if a politician stood up and said, "No, we don't like
done with
education.
education.
Done with education. Who needs
Back
it?"
up the chimneys.
Yeah. And so it was all sort of a bit motherhood and apple pie,
Well,
wasn't it?
it was basically to tell us ahead of the Chancellor that there would be tax cuts. And I think this is a real reminder. Tax cuts in some shape or form, personal tax cuts in tomorrow's budget autumn statement. And I think it's a real reminder that the statement that the Chancellor makes, which we all think is about economics, is actually all about politics. And if I go back to our times at the BBC, I remember on the days of the budget, there was a real fight on the 10 o'clock running order between the economics editor and the political editor as to who thought the budget day belonged to them. And actually, it's really
An
interesting.
unresolved question, I think it's fair
An
to say.
unresolved question, which was that the economics editor was kind of right in that they understood the numbers and the maths and the way it calculated and whether it actually fitted within the fiscal rules or all the rest of it. But make no mistake, it's all about the politics. And this one is particularly about the politics. It is probably one of the last times we're going to hear an economic statement before the election. And so this is absolutely about laying out the groundwork for Rishi Sunak's election campaign, not Jeremy Hunt's numbers game, really.
And it's the last, I mean, it probably is the last fiscal event, as it's now delightfully come to be known, that people might feel the consequences of in any serious way before the election. There'll be a budget in March, but I mean, assuming the election is in the autumn, the chances of much of that taking effect in any significant way are pretty small. I suppose there could be another autumn statement if the election's really pushed. So, it is really politically important. And you're right, Millie, this was all basically about, as Hunt as well has been well trailing now, this is the narrative they're trying to say is we, post-Truss, steadied the ship. We've got inflation under control, although it is worth reminding ourselves that, yes, it's now been halved from its peak, but it's still just under 5%. That's 3% above the government Bank of England target, so it's not like inflation is no longer a problem. But now, partly as a result of the fact that it looks like the Office of Budget Responsibility are going to deliver 20 billion of so-called fiscal headroom, i.e. over the 5-year time horizon, they think there's going to be about 20 billion pounds more for the Chancellor to spend as a result of increased revenues than they thought there would have been 6 months ago. This is all make-believe money, by the way. This money doesn't exist yet.
And it's make-believe rules.
And it's
the
make-believe
fiscal rules are wherever you decide to put them in the first place.
It's just all theoretical stuff. But that theoretically, that would allow the Chancellor to have room to cut direct taxation, i.e. on income or national insurance, in a way that perhaps he didn't anticipate he would a few months ago. And so he's going to do it in 2 stages. Some tomorrow, probably we think on national insurance, and then possibly on income tax. And then again in the March budget, is enabled to say, and you heard this in Sunak's speech yesterday, he was honing in, and I think some Labour people are increasingly concerned about this, he was honing in on that thing that I was asking Starmer about last week, which was this 28 billion of green investment spending. And Sunak's line was, and I think we're going to hear more of that going up to the election, is they're going to spend this 28 billion. Okay, our record on tax isn't brilliant. Yes, taxes are high, but that's because of the war in Ukraine. That's because of the COVID pandemic. But they're going to spend 28 billion a year, they say.
Well, they don't say.
They don't say, yeah.
I mean, that's the important thing, that Keir Starmer's already
backtracked. But at some point it will get to 28 billion.
It's a dividing line that is being created to define Labour's for the Conservatives.
Exactly. So Sunak
they're different from us.
That's 28 billion they're not going to have to spend on tax cuts. And we are. So that is the dividing line that increasingly is going to be created. The other one was, and I think there is like real clear political water now in economic thinking and philosophy opened up between the two parties, as Sunak was explaining yesterday. Labour are going in hard behind a Biden-esque kind of plan, without all of the money, admittedly, but around this idea of securonomics, of onshoring domestic production, reindustrialisation, subsidising green energy production, all of this sort of stuff.
Creating more jobs from green energy.
Well, that is that's the Labour line on it. Sunak is now going in quite hard behind a much more Thatcherite, much more traditional Conservative message of saying this is old-fashioned industrial policy. It is picking winners. It is going to be inflationary. It's going to waste a load of money. Now, you can argue about that, and Sunak's position is definitely cutting against the international tide of opinion, politically and economically, but you can argue about it. What is interesting about it is that it is further affirmation that this Conservative Party is going to go into the election with a political and economic agenda which is far more akin to the Osborne-Cameron agenda of 2015-16, than it would be Johnson 2019, because guess who loves a bit of picking winners? Well, it's the Red Wall, because that is what partly that was all about. It was about reindustrialisation. It was about supporting industry to try and support levelling up and so on. So it is yet further confirmation of what we saw last week with the Cameron restoration, that this is a Chancellor and Prime Minister who are far more akin to Cameron and Osborne himself than, for example, Johnson.
The framing of this is so interesting as well, because I had a really good time this morning. I was looking back to Ken Clarke's 1996 budget.
Oh, what a morning.
I was playing tennis, but I also, before I played tennis, thank you for
with
dropping
Ken Clarke.
me in it.
He beat him. Ken Clarke, that is.
He's not so fast around the court
sets.
now. That sounds
Cigar
fine.
in one hand, racket in the other.
Go on.
Yeah. So the 1996 budget was framed in such similar
My
terms.
first political memory.
As a result of the tough decisions that we have taken, we now find that we can afford to do this. What will the Labour Party do? I mean, it was interesting to see how similar the framing was. Of course, a year later, it didn't work out so well.
There are no new tricks, really, are there in a budget?
You are trying to frame the Labour Party as the big spenders who are going to raise your taxes, and that, then it was Ken Clarke, after 16 years of Conservative rule, trying to say, God, we've still got energy, and I'll be back here next year and I'll be doing budgets again and all the rest of it. And I think that you've got Jeremy Hunt, who was going to try and pull off a similar trick when he stands up tomorrow in the Commons.
I'm looking at some of the polling on taxation. It's really interesting, going back to this whole question of whether it's about economics or politics, because generally people approve of, this is Ipsos, but people approve of taxes on higher earners. Big surprise, because most people aren't higher earners, so therefore they approve
Or even if they are, they don't think they are.
They kind of get it's fair. And the ones that aren't seen as fair are inheritance tax, fuel duty and council tax. And it's interesting that the biggest one that is seen as unfair is inheritance tax. 43% of those polled think it's unfair,
Probably
which is
wrong about that,
fascinating,
I'm
right? Because
There was such an eye roll from Lewis Goodall at that.
They're just wrong.
but the point is that very few people are caught in the inheritance
tax
trap.
3%,
so
4%.
it's a really easy one for the government, that, because they're not actually saving that much money. They've only got 4% of the people who are paying it, and 43% think it's unfair, so they could get rid of it. I'm just saying, if you're playing politics on it, that would be the first one. And 34% of people think that income tax paid on income between £12,500 and 50,000 is unfair. So that's going to be the place, clearly, that if you want to make your political gains, that's where you're going to
I saw a great meme of Rishi Sunak on a London bus, sort of leaning over and speaking to a woman, and the balloon coming out of Rishi Sunak's mouth is, "I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut your benefits, but at least my children won't have to pay inheritance tax when I die." And it's kind of, that is an effective, it's a vulnerability for the Tories if they make this the priority.
And it looks like it was being briefed, about a week ago, that was the direction they were going in. It looks like instead they're actually going to focus on direct taxation, i.e. income or national income tax or national insurance. But it is worth us just saying, leaving aside any potential changes they might make to benefits, which obviously affect the poorest people most, there's going to be a load of stuff we hear tomorrow about this being a tax-cutting autumn statement. Let's not forget, almost certainly, whatever changes he makes around income tax or national insurance, as in this financial year coming, the government will be taxing more than it did in the previous year. Partly as a result of things like fiscal drag, which is where if the government does not uprate with inflation, which they haven't been for many years now, the rates at which you say pay the higher rate of income tax, then more and more people are dragged into it. So what they're giving you with one hand, they're basically taking away with the other. And it's actually a bit worse than that, because if you uprate the rate at which you, or decrease the band in terms of you go down from say 20% to 19%, but you don't change the actual bracket around fiscal drag, then actually for various complicated reasons that benefits richer people than it does poorer people, including richer people as taxpayers versus poorer ones. So just take with a pinch of salt any idea that this is a grand tax cutting budget or autumn statement tomorrow, because in the grand scheme of things it won't be.
It'll be the giveaway that costs us more.
We will be talking about this at length. Will we not?
Won't we?
Tomorrow. Yes.
Oh, you
I
bet.
bet you're
Tomorrow,
excited.
the
Tomorrow,
economy.
Exactly.
Again,
on
the news agents.
Can't wait.
Before we go, Maitlis, have you got some personal news?
No.
I think you have.
Oh, I do love killing an outro, though.
You really did.
Okay, I'm going to tell it to you.
Go on.
Amazon has put together a 3-part drama in the sort of very British scandal mould, very royal scandal, I think this one is.
About the news agents.
About the news agents. It's all the terrible things you get up to with your chewed biros, primarily.
Yep.
And
Have you been to Pizza Express in Woking?
Have I? No, I believe it's now basically been turned into a museum to Emily, a shrine to Emily. So
do you know,
I
my
can't
godson
go.
keeps asking me to take him to Pizza Express.
You've got to go one day. Just turn up, just see what they say.
Complicatedly,
Go
there
with
are two. There are actually two. I do my research on this.
Yeah, of course.
I just didn't want to send him to the wrong one. It would have been terrible. You know, there is
So
no
go
blue
on.
plan.
Anyway, so you're being played.
Oh, this is the bit that really excites you. John Sopel adores Ruth Wilson and cannot believe that when she came in to talk to us with her movement coach and her voice coach.
You went on holiday, were you?
Yes, he was. He was in Australia.
That's amazing. Oh,
yeah,
that was unlucky.
He's
that she
now
happened to catch you on
ruining
one
the
of those
day. He went,
weeks.
you will get a chance to meet Ruth Wilson, John Sopel.
Can I just ask you this? What do you feel about being played by someone who's tended to play psycho characters in the past? I just wondered whether there was any degree of typecasting there.
Continuation of a theme
it's
for
funny, isn't
Emily.
it? I normally see her sort of clutching her wrists and pulling at her jumpers with her hair coming out in clumps and a very glassy dazed look as she hits the bottle. Yeah, no, I think that could work.
But she's never played a character with a whippet before, so I mean, I'm sure it's a bit
And what a whippet.
And what a whippet
Hang on,
Moody is.
They've actually got a whippet in the show.
Okay, as Lewis unkindly pointed out, yes, I was on holiday when Ruth Wilson came in with her movement coach. I have heard it said by the team that at one point you went and sat in the whippet's little bed and making a phone call to a cabinet minister to check out some fact or other. And Ruth Wilson is going, is this for real? Is that correct?
They've actually
Is that
created
correct?
a whippet bed.
I'm sorry. I'm going to have to
I think
push
it
you.
might have been. It's quite a calm, silent place to make your calls to people. If you're
Sitting
trying to
in
block
Moody's
out,
bed.
yes, trying to block out the noise of the office. We should also say, I know it goes Ruth Wilson and then the Whippet, but Michael Sheen is playing Prince Andrew, and I went to see him
How
on set.
complimentary for Prince Andrew.
I know, phenomenal.
That's probably the best thing that's happened to him in this whole saga, I would have thought.
I mean,
Oh, come on. What about Prince Charles being played by
Dominic West.
Dominic West? I mean, that was pretty flattering
Yeah,
to
I suppose
Prince
I
Charles.
suppose that is true.
That wasn't a great thing that happened to Andrew, though.
No.
To be fair,
Yeah. So anyway, have you been on the set then?
been on the set.
And
Met Joanna Scanlon as well. Terry,
The great
to you.
Joanna Scanlon.
Yeah, from the thick of it.
Yeah.
And they're just the most extraordinary, exceptional cast. And yeah.
did you feel excited by it, watching it?
I felt terrified, obviously. And I felt quite sort of
Vulnerable?
yes. No, but some of the scenes are very they're quite poignant, actually. There's
Personal?
there's a scene to Andrew where he suddenly realised the one we saw was when his lawyers are telling him that he might get extradited, and I suddenly kind of went, oh my God, I'd sort of forgotten that whole aspect of it, So you suddenly remember that you're dealing with people's lives again, and it is a kind of weird thing. I mean, I don't mean to be all po-faced, but it is a bit weird like that. But an amazing cast.
And to be clear, the newsagent's sequel is coming.
That's right. Yes.
Rowan Atkinson playing John, of course.
Oh,
right.
bugger off!
Yeah, and you're being played by, remind me, is it Daniel Craig?
No,
Very
but
physical.
I think sort of Matt Smith or
There'll be
Andrew
some-
Garfield or someone like
someone out
that.
of play school. won't
Yeah, it
It'll be
will.
some, like,
Floella
kid in
Benjamin.
shorts.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
Wow, that is rogue casting. But yeah, you know what? I'm up for it. A peer, a Lib Dem peer, why not?
Our producers are now tearing clumps of hair out of their heads, thinking this is never going to end. We'll see you
Right,
tomorrow.
bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.